Hello there and welcome to the latest in our little Rusty Compass series on the best places to take a casual dip in Sydney. Today I'm at one of the most perfect, gorgeous places you can take a dip in Sydney's spectacular harbour. I'm at Camp Cove. And this place is special not only as a gorgeous place to experience Sydney Harbour, but it's also a pretty important historical site. We'll start our little journey to Camp Cove in the nicest possible way, by ferry from Circular Quay. The regular Watsons Bay ferry gives you a good look at the best of Sydney Harbour on your way to one of the harbour's most picturesque swimming spots. It's almost 50 years since Queen Elizabeth opened this magnificent structure. And as I get to know Sydney all over again, I still feel a kind of disbelief that something as astonishingly brave and beautiful as this could have been built here, especially in the late 60s and early 70s. Of course, the real story of the Opera House is far more messy than the postcard picture. But that's for another time. The ferry takes about 20 minutes and it takes us past some of Sydney's most exclusive suburbs and expensive real estate. We dock at Watsons Bay, still a cute little spot that has retained a village feel. It's somehow managed to stay a little detached from the suburbs around it and from the rest of the city. It's hard to believe you've only just left Sydney's busy centre. Camp Cove is a lovely 10-minute walk from here. It's pretty much accepted by historians, and there's a plaque up there from the 1920s to confirm so, that this is where Captain Arthur Phillip first set foot in Sydney Harbour in January 1788. So the first fleet, the 11 ships of the first fleet had landed south of here at Botany Bay, but after a couple of days Arthur Phillip was persuaded or convinced that Botany Bay wasn't suitable for the penal colony that he'd been sent to build. So he and some of his officers jumped aboard 3 rowboats, which I just find extraordinary, and headed north. And they'd heard of Sydney Harbour. Captain Cook had chartered it back in 1770, and they headed in. They headed in through the heads, which are very close to us here. Now, of course, Camp Cove had been occupied by Gadigal Aboriginal people for thousands of years beforehand, and it wasn't long before this also became the site of one of the very first exchanges in Sydney Harbour between the Indigenous people and Arthur Phillip's men. One of the things I've really enjoyed about exploring Australian history over the past 12 months or so is sort of discovering, really for the first time for me, how much material exists, first-hand accounts from people that were aboard the first fleet. And that's just incredible. I'm about to run aground here. But there's a first-hand account of that early encounter here between Phillip's men in early January and the Gadigal Aboriginal people who were living here at the time, and as I say, it's said to have been a fairly amicable kind of exchange, and things then subsequent to that turned sour, and there's a report of a visit here sometime after that, and things between the whites and the local indigenous people had deteriorated. And there are so many stories like this in Australian history, and from my limited experience, it seems that for the most part the local Aboriginal people were remarkably gracious in dealing with these invaders, but ultimately the invaders would spoil and sort of poison the prospects of some kind of amicable arrangement. It's kind of amazing to me to think about the idea that the sort of rock features of this place probably don't look any different to how they looked for thousands of years when Gadigal indigenous people lived here, and when Arthur Phillip and his men rolled up in January 1788 as well, and no doubt they probably ended up scrambling over these rocks as well. After you swim, take a walk north along the South Head Heritage Trail for another dose of Sydney history as the sun goes down. Huge areas of the Sydney Harbour foreshore are part of the Sydney Harbour National Park, and so there are these wonderful walking trails in lots of places around the harbour. When Sydney was in fear of invasion, and it has been for big chunks of its history, these heads were very important to the city's defence. They were the only gateway. There's been some kind of defence presence here for more than 2 centuries. And there are lots of remnants of that presence as you make your way to South Head. Defences were ramped up in World War II when the Japanese took an interest in sinking Allied ships in Sydney Harbour. In May 1942, a Japanese midget submarine successfully broke through a net not far from here. A torpedo it fired hit a ferry in use by the Navy, killing 19 servicemen. The distinctive red and white stripes of the Hornby Lighthouse are markers for South Head. The lighthouse was built in 1858 in the wake of the wreck of the Dunbar the year before that claimed 121 lives. To this day, Sydney's worst maritime disaster. The Dunbar had managed to survive 81 days at sea on its journey from England, only to misjudge its arrival at Sydney Heads, crashing onto rocks close by here at what is now known as the Gap. I can gaze across Sydney Heads for a long time, thinking about the ships and the people who have passed through here, my own ancestors, and the first peoples who flourished here for thousands of years before Phillip turned up in his 3 rowboats at Camp Cove and decided this should be the location for his new colony. Thanks for joining me at Camp Cove and South Head, and we'll talk again soon.